Okay, welcome everyone to this session of the Smart Cities 2020 conference. We are doing this virtual, and this session is the many different flavors of open data. We have got an outstanding panel here this afternoon. We've got Carlos Rivero, Chief Data Officer, Commonwealth of Virginia, Dr. Peter Perjand, Executive Director for Global Public Sector, Oracle Corporation, and Kim Winzerl, Chief Data Officer for the state of Tennessee. Welcome, panelists. Really glad to have you here. So this is going to be a conversation about open data, and when we talk about open data, we're also going to touch on data analytics. Just as kind of a preview, we've been addressing data analytics, open data, data management at NASCIO for many, many years, and we always try to get a pulse of where the state CIOs are. And we've been promoting the Chief Data Officer network very heavily and trying to get people to engage with them because here's where we are. We are emphasizing this concept of insight enabling analytics, so analytics that are useful and are assisting decision makers in understanding what the circumstances are and making the best choices that then lead to policy and then citizen outcomes. But you can see the role of the state CIO has changed a little bit over the years. We've seen an emphasis on taking the lead, advocating data as a strategic asset, and the CDO network is doing the same thing. Data governance, we're going to get into some of that a little later in this discussion. And then we've asked our state CIOs in what are the following areas does your state utilize data analytics? And you can see there's a lot of transparency and accountability, particularly to citizens. And this is where open data will play a major role. Dashboards, meaningful reports, we're going to get into some of this. And citizen is data scientist, data-driven policy making. And then we've asked as well, what categories of services are your top priorities for migration to the cloud? Well, one of those is open data. So with that, I also want to make everyone aware that the State Chief Data Officer Network has recently published this great resource. It's a roadmap that discusses policy making, program operations, integrated data, and for a variety of scenarios, they present this framework for success: lead, plan, build, share, analyze, sustain. And then as you get into the various scenarios, you will see one or more of these recommendations coming forth. But let's go back to our panelists here, and let's kick things off with a question to Carlos. Thank you for being here, Carlos. I've got a question here for you. You did this great initiative in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and tell us about how you brought together these various players as part of the FACT Data Trust, including federal, state, local, and private organizations. I just made a short list of who you have there: Virginia Department of Criminal Justice, State Police, Community Service Board, private healthcare system. You've got many more people on that. But tell us a little bit about how you brought these players together. How were you able to convince them to participate?
So as you know, Eric, a big part of our job is persuasion, influence, and coercion sometimes, right? And but in this case, the legislation that created my position also mandated that I work on an opioid pilot project. And so having the backing of the General Assembly behind me, as well as the governor, really kind of gave a little bit more credibility and urgency to the work that we're doing and bringing people to the table. But I think really more than that, though, because even that, even with all of that behind you, you still have resistance to data sharing in some organizations. So what we ended up doing is really looking across the Commonwealth and identifying coalitions that are already working with substance use disorder and really being affected, whose communities are really being affected by the opioid epidemic. And so we identified the Northwest or the Northern Shenandoah Valley Substance Use Coalition as an organization that had enough organizational maturity, had enough respect and trust amongst its members, amongst the coalition members, who included law enforcement and a private health system and community service and a wide variety of different groups that were engaged in this substance use epidemic, and had, like I said before, had enough respect and trust for each other that knew that they wanted to continue to work together. We're just having difficulty understanding how. Like, how do we actually share our data assets? How do we build intelligence that's going to let everyone know what do they need to do next, right? How to best respond in whatever lane they're in, right? Whatever line of business they're in. How do they best respond to the opioid crisis with the intelligence that's being provided as the data is being integrated? And so having that organizational maturity along with digital readiness really helped to kind of catapult that project to be more successful. So we didn't have to spend a whole lot of time persuading, influencing, and coercing people to really share their data. They already, felt the pain of not being able to really address this epidemic holistically and wanted to get together and share their data. So as a result of that, we were then able to present not just the technical platform of how do we consolidate our data assets, what data analytics do we need to run, whose result sets will then be incorporated into the intelligence platform that will allow them to make better informed data-driven decisions, but also building up that data trust. And I know we'll maybe talk a little bit about the data trust later, but essentially it's that legal framework that facilitates data sharing amongst many different partners, right? So historically within the Commonwealth, we've really been working on point-to-point sharing of data assets, right? Where one specific organization is looking for data from another specific organization, and then they get into the data sharing agreement process, right? Where their respective attorneys kind of hash it out for 6, 9, sometimes even 12 months, and then you only establish one agreement. So really is looking at it more holistically. When you're trying to share data amongst multiple parties, that is not an efficient nor effective approach. We really need something more encompassing, and that's where the data trust comes into play.
I think an important aspect of your response here, Carlos, is the necessity of having the capabilities to build relationships. And so the chief data officer is a relationship builder.
Yes, absolutely a relationship builder and a catalyst for action.
Yeah, that's great. And you've got a great personality, a great communication skills, relationship skills. You're an outstanding chief data officer. Peter, I've got a question for you. You were instrumental in bringing technology innovations to cities like Napa and Palo Alto. Thinking about the business of city government, engaging citizens, licensing, code enforcement, permitting, economic development, what was the driver or the inspiration for you to do so?
Thanks, Eric. Pleasure to be here and join Carlos and Kim. Thanks for organizing this panel. So yeah, I mean, from my perspective, working in the local government, it was really about transparency. The first thing that I was told by the people that I was serving are quote unquote customers, which include citizens of the city as well as customers and constituents and even internal customers. They needed to know first and foremost where they were in the process. The process meaning, the development review process. They needed transparency in all the information that was being received, processed, and returned to them. They needed predictability. They needed to understand what is the next step and how long would that next step take. They needed to understand what the costs were going to be, what the process was going to be. So predictability became a pillar of what led to some of the innovation that we drove. And then probably the most instrumental piece of that was the analytics. Never before had the department in the city of Palo Alto, when I came there, and again in Napa, the data to drive informed decisions just wasn't there in real time. Oftentimes we see in local government, reports are generated at the end of the month or at the end of the quarter. By that time, the information is stale. You're always driving by looking into the rearview mirror instead of looking in the road in front of you. And so we've really tried to make that transition of providing real-time information so that you could course correct rather than make a giant correction after the fact, after you've made decisions. So having real-time available and really working towards open API infrastructure so that you can have access to that data really became instrumental and really pivotal for our decisions to make better informed direction and provide information back to our constituents and to the council when we were asking for additional funding. So what really drove the decision to do some of the transformation that I did in Palo Alto and later again in Napa was that ability to provide transparency, predictability, and analytics to make informed decisions as we went through the process.
Very good, Peter. Kim, I've got a question for you. And this is more one of those soft line questions. I'm really interested, and I think everybody else would be as well. And everyone's got a story to tell, but how did you get interested in data management and analytics? How did that become such an important thing for you?
Thank you, Eric, for inviting me to participate on this panel. I have been in IT for well over 30 years and worked for some very large companies, some mid-sized companies, and now for the state of Tennessee. Working in large companies, you get the opportunity to do a lot of different things. So in global jobs, I was able to do application development support, infrastructure development support, process, service management work. But it seems like about every 4 to 6 years, I would land back in data. So it's been a passion since the get-go. Even as a COBOL programmer years ago, my favorite part was building the test data sets and making sure that we had quality data there. So
there's a few of us who started with COBOL program, including yours truly. Here's another question for you. How are you enabling Tennessee citizens with government data and presentation of that data, whether it's landscape, Tennessee Department of Transportation, economic development, realtors, developers, there's just a variety of people that are exploiting your open data portal. So how are you enabling them? How would you describe that process?
Yeah, so we've got really right now 3 different ways that citizens can get to the state data. One is through a new website called Transparent Tennessee. On this website, you get to see all of the financial indicators and numbers for the state of Tennessee. And then you also get to see the performance against the state's projects and programs. So over there, that's where the governor's top projects are housed. And all the performance and spend against those is freely shared. One thing that's in there, we call it Open Maps, which is a series of Tableau maps and dashboards to where you can take I think we got about 90 different maps out there, 90 different sources of data, and map it all the way down to your county or various regions of the state. Other things on the financial side, you can see the state's checkbook, so you understand, where the spend is going to who. Just to give you some data stats, back in 2019, we had nearly 50,000 unique visitors to this Transparent Tennessee site, with about 130,000 or so hits for the year. So wow. It's gaining popularity. A lot of our citizens are interested. The reason this website was put together was because the state was just getting inundated with open records requests. So this is a way to start dropping that volume and just putting the data directly into the hands of the citizens. Second way we're doing it is we've got an open data portal out there. We've got 98 data sets, CSV format, Excel format, covering about 20 different departments. So you can check that out. And then the third way is through our GIS systems. So our geospatial information systems, one of the best across the states. Actually, our lead just got a national award around that. We just finished up the LiDAR project across the state, took 5 years. This is where you shoot laser lights from airplanes to get the geography of the state all mapped. But the way that we are going about letting the citizens know that these 3 different solutions are out there is through public webinars.
Okay.
We're doing those almost every single month, sharing those through actual news press releases. We just had a release of a website go live on Monday, and we had a tremendous amount of interest and activity once that press release went out. So that seems to be the best way we're hitting, the landscape architects, the realty agencies, some of the developers across the state. They're finding that having this data available, having the maps available for the work they do, is helping them to be able to do their work in advance. Like prior to having to do a site visit, they can actually get a lot of the information that they would need up front.
Very good. Very good. Carlos, let's go back to you. A term that you used earlier is data trust. Why do you call it a data trust, Carlos?
Well, so there's 2 reasons, Eric. One is that trust is the foundation of the data sharing relationship, right? And so without trust, you cannot get into that kind of relationship or manage any kind of relationship for that matter, regardless if it's data sharing or not. But also because of the way that the data trust is established, right? There is a data provider who is the data trust member, but then there is a trustee, which is my office, right? The office of the CDO acts as the trustee of the data trust, making sure that we are accountable and responsible for making sure that only those data assets and data elements are shared with only those organizations and individuals that have been designated to receive those data assets. So this isn't a data commons where a data trust member can put data in there and all the members have free-for-all access to it. That's not how it works. Just because you're a data trust member doesn't mean you get access to any data.
Okay.
You still have to go through the data trust user project proposal process to document, why do you need this data? Why do you need restricted use data? How is it aligned with Commonwealth goals and objectives? What is your project purpose? What are some of the products that you're going to generate out of this data, right? And intelligence products, reports, publications, what have you, and then give our data stewards in each of the different agencies whose data you're using an opportunity to review the different products that you're creating so that they can say, yeah, this is consistent with our data release policy. You're not sharing any classified or sensitive data in any of your products. So at the end of the day, the data trust is really once a foundational component. Trust is a foundational component, but also that a trustee is in the middle of all of the relationships to making sure that everything is done the way it's supposed to be.
That's a powerful term and powerful meaning behind it, Carlos. That's really great. Peter, I want to go over to you. Particularly given your experience in local government. We talk a lot about embracing real-time analytics, which you were touched on earlier, but we talk about it as well in state government. Real-time analytics that engages citizens and business. In local government, you were closer to the citizen, thinking about practical use of technology, and you see some of the practical uses of open data in Tennessee that Kim described. But, for instance, some cities will not allow their employees, their inspectors, to climb ladders or scaffolding to inspect roof construction during and even after construction. But how about employing drones and capturing visually some of that data and bringing that into actually part of the building inspection report? Maybe unmanned aerial vehicles for data collection, visual data analytics, analysis, decision-making. Did you see some of that in Palo Alto and Napa, or were those things you were anticipating doing someday?
So, back in 2012, when I started in the city of Palo Alto as their development services director, the open data movement had just started. And Palo Alto was one of the first cities through our chief innovation officer at the time, chief information officer, Jonathan Reichenthal, made a decision and took to the council to support an open data first platform. So we made it a decision among the leadership staff in the city that we would make every effort to provide all of our data in an open and accessible format. So I tell you a little bit about the good and the bad from that experiment, and how it really made to more informed decisions with real-time data. In the early days of open data, we thought, as many cities thought and state agencies, that if you provide it, they will come. If you provide the data, startup companies will come out of the woodwork and start using that data to create innovative new technologies and applications to solve complicated and important problems within their local agency. That happened sometimes, and it happened definitely when we hosted hackathons and other events that promoted that kind of behavior and activity. But for the most part, where we struggled and where I struggled was the data that we would make available wasn't the cleanest data. It wasn't the most vetted data. And what we did need to do, and what we learned to do, was ensure that the data that we made available to our partners, constituents, and just openly available was standardized, was formatted, was able to be shared and utilized in ways that could be created into an application that would be beneficial to the consumers of that data. So we took it one step further, and the direction that we ended up taking our open data platform was not only to make it available, but also to pre-consume it for our constituents, for those people that would be looking at that data. What we did is we created views of the data that we knew would be beneficial to others, or partnered strategically with startups that knew what they needed from the data and could ask us specific questions about what they needed from the data. So we could front load some of that information into the data set that we provided. And the best example of that was our good friends at Building Eye, that when I first started in Palo Alto, I was introduced to the CIO, or the CEO at the time, and we immediately came to an understanding and were able to identify data that normally would be very difficult for people to see when it wasn't made available in a spatial orientation. But once we did, it became extremely helpful and useful for people. And so we've seen time and time again, when you partner with the right startups and you're able to provide that real-time data to your customers in a consumable format, it becomes that much more relevant and that much more useful. So real-time data in and of itself isn't as important as when you're able to deliver it in a way that's consumable and easily digestible, if you will, by the architects, by the realtors, by the residents that need that data. So
Peter, did you see some retrospective on that as well? So when they saw what you could provide, did they ask for new things? And so there was some iterations going on here in terms of what you provided.
That led to a variety of new startups coming to us, asking us, could you provide this and could you provide that? Which we were happy to do, because we became kind of like a startup incubator of sorts. We had a host of startups come to us, partly because of our platform, but also because our willingness to partner with them. And when they said, what is the next important thing you think constituents would need? So oftentimes startups don't necessarily understand the domain well enough to provide the answers to the questions, but they have the technology and the wherewithal to assemble a solution that would be able to answer those questions. So as a champion for open data, you had to do more than just make the data available. You had to have a sense of what were the type of challenges that you needed to address, and what data might you be able to reach to start uncovering some of those questions through an open data platform or through a partnership with a startup.
Yeah, so like Carlos and Kim, you're actually providing consulting services to citizens and companies. That is very, very impressive. Kim, I want to come over back to you. Just relative to your work in Tennessee, what frameworks or bodies of knowledge or centers of excellence are you referencing? I think everyone is looking for those best references to have on their bookshelf, and relationships with centers of excellence. We've been promoting the DIMBOK and DAMA through our work. But what are you using, Kim?
Yeah, so DAMA definitely. So the DAMA Data Management Body of Knowledge book, which there's a new release out.
Right.
Everything I've put together, the last 3 places I've worked, that's the foundational piece. As far as centers of excellence, looking for things like the CDO network, looking for those that have different, deeper experiences than you have, just to aid in having better decision making and a little camaraderie when it comes to interest in the same topics.
Mm-hmm.
As far as a framework for data governance, at the state of Tennessee, and I think we got a slide on this, we call it the 8 elements of data governance. And I'm not going to take full credit because I developed this out of insight from a lot of data celebrities like David Lotion, William McKnight, Wayne Eckerson, Bob Seiner, Peter Aiken, a whole host of folks that I've followed their works, read their books, studied what they put together. But this particular framework, it takes the high points of anything you could possibly do when you're working through data governance. And it provides you with a checklist to make sure, if you're doing data governance, are you really doing it completely? Are you doing it accurately? Do others understand it when they see it? So we're working through this framework, 1 through 8. The first box is organization. Hard to do anything data governance wise if you don't have a data owner, you don't have those data stewards, you might be wasting your time. So really getting into the roles, responsibilities, building those governing committees. Second box is policies. This is where you're going to write down the laws around your particular data that you're governing. What exactly do you, how do you get access to it? What do you do about retention and storage and things like that? Box 3 is the procedures. So this is the how-to behind all of the policies that you write. Exactly how do you give access? How do you maybe audit for usage, things like that. Fourth box is standards and definitions. This is your business glossary, your data dictionary, valid values, safe sources identified. All of that goes in this particular box. Box 5 is architecture, and that is both the business side as well as the technology side. So these are your data flow diagrams, your data models, data category charts, even, a reference architecture as to, where the data resides in what database on what, hardware. The next box, 6, this is your all about security. So, what's the risk if this data, was put into the wrong hands, managing a risk mitigation plan, understanding who has access, how they got access, and having standard work published around how you handle all of the forms of security and administration around it. Box 7 is metrics and reporting, and this is not about using the data. This is about the data. So, what is your data quality level? What's your cleanliness level? Putting that together so you make sure that your data stays permanently in a usable form by, putting some type of a control chart around it. And then the last box is probably the most important box, because I don't know about Carlos and Peter, but when you get an internal or an external audit that comes in and says, hey, I want to see how you're governing this critical set of data, in this box, you're always ready. This is where you have links, live links to your evidence. So you can, prove the 7 boxes before it, prove all of that, because you've documented in a live document pointing to all of your evidence. So you, to some degree, stop having to work that fire drill of forming a small team to respond to an audit because you're always ready.
Right.
Yeah. So behind this, there's a guidebook and a playbook, which are just templates for documenting it. But yeah, this is what we're doing. We've piloted it with our longitudinal data system here over last month. Getting ready to roll it out across the entire state now.
Something we do across NASU all the time. We're learning from everybody, and we encourage reuse. I just went out to our resource page to find out, well, what do we have on data governance? And I pulled all of these reports we did, but most importantly, I think we're seeing all of these submittals to our awards program relative to open data platforms, use of analytics. So we encourage reuse. You know, if you're going to start an open data initiative or you're going to advance yours, go and see what these other states have done and check in with the CDO network and their guidance and reuse what's already there. I've got a question back to you, Carlos. You put in place a self-service analytics layer to enable state and local organizations to create reports and dashboards and study incident maps to quickly identify populations that need immediate help. How do you make a self-service layer, which appears to be incorporating advanced analytics, augmented analytics, but to make that a friendly layer that people will use?
So Eric, I mean, really the key is what questions are they trying to answer, right? And in many cases, I mean, obviously you don't know all the questions are going to be posed, so you really have to try to think about what are some of the potentialities with regards to the queries that they're going to make. But the reality is, you know, there are a variety of different analytics and intelligence products that we create are really geared towards the different perspectives that we're trying to answer, whether it's the law enforcement perspective or the health services perspective or the community leader perspective. So looking at all those different perspectives that are, you know, potentially looking at the analytics that we're providing, then giving them the intelligence that they need in the format and structure that's going to allow them to make the easiest data-driven decisions possible. So it's really understanding your audience, right? And getting a better feel for what are the types of things that they're dealing with at the ground level. Because, you know, it isn't just about executives getting access to a dashboard that tells them what's happening at the strategic level. There's also things that are happening at the tactical and, more importantly, at the operational level, where our people are interfacing directly with our stakeholders, right? Our residents across the state of Virginia that are expecting government services to help them with very specific outcomes. And so being able to understand those interactions and then create the analytics and the intelligence platform that's going to facilitate getting them to the right decision, to the right actionable decision fastest, is really what that's all about. And at the end of the day, it's really getting to know your customer and what they need.
Again, it's that relationship building aspect of the CDO's office. Again, communication is so important to your office.
Yeah, absolutely. Critical.
Peter, I want to actually pursue that a little further with this next question to you. In an unprecedented time in our country, we have states and cities trying to continue the business of government in a remote way. An important aspect of analytics is something you can't collect with a sensor, and that's that citizen contact we were just talking about with Carlos. In order to not only ask for and receive their feedback, but to capture the nuances of human behavior, their emotions, their feelings about issues, all of which assists in addressing citizen concerns and prioritizing efforts. Can you speak to that aspect of the interaction with citizens, virtual town halls, or how you might have done something like this in Napa and Palo Alto and maybe some other situations you may be in now working with Oracle?
Right. So there's many layers to this. So pre-COVID, post-COVID, and the eventual post-vaccine for COVID, we're experiencing three very different worlds. Pre-COVID, virtual town halls, virtual engagement was a nice to have, but it wasn't a must have. It was an augmentation on top of normal parliamentary style meetings and community engagement meetings. And there were startups that were trying to get a foothold in that virtual space, but nothing was really taking shape because people kind of gravitated towards the tried and true, come to the city hall or state agency for the public hearing and what have you. Post-COVID, we saw that change 180 degrees. Immediately, cities, counties, states needed to reinvent the way that they did public hearings. And they leaned on tools that weren't necessarily set up for public hearings, but they kind of used what they had and they were able to limp by. Going forward, post-vaccine, we know that cities and state agencies are going to be looking for more of a permanent solution so they can do more than just limp along, but to have a very secure platform that they can actually provide engagement opportunities, whether it be a city council meeting or just a very loose public engagement event. They want to be able to accommodate people regardless of whether they are in physical proximity to the engagement. And so in my previous experience in Palo Alto, the experience was with startups that really try to provide a new layer, a new omni-channel approach to engagement. And our experience was that they were nice, but there wasn't ubiquitous adoption of that technology. And so you oftentimes had to choose between the live participant or the virtual participant, and the live participant always got the priority. And so virtual participation was augmenting the live participation. So you would be able to get information from companies that had remote engagement, and then you'd layer that on top of the actual engagement, the real-time event that you would have, and get some additional layers and perspectives of an issue, whether it's a land use issue or whatnot. Going forward, now we've seen companies and startups that do sentiment analysis, and Oracle has been working very hard in trying to approach the right methodology, strategy towards sentiment analysis and communication tools. So post-COVID, communication became a huge issue. We worked very closely with a small Southern California city to help improve the way they communicate during a crisis. And that communication was augmenting their emergency operations systems. So quickly being able to deploy information about where to get tested for COVID. And even during some of the fires that we've been experiencing, where to get information on the latest developments on fires in California. We had a tremendous number of fires, or the latest information about what services are now going to be open in light of COVID and how they're going to be brought back online. So that multi-directional communications channel is something that Oracle has been working heavily on, that is able to use artificial intelligence, machine learning, as well as your standard community engagement platform, so people can quickly and easily report activity that's been happening, non-emergency activity that's been happening in their city, to be able to get responded to. City of San Jose was able to quickly move their entire 311 activity offline, meaning people would work from home and be able to respond quickly and effectively to people that had specific questions about activity or service requests. We've seen examples of that in Jacksonville, Florida, where we had a similar approach to not only providing that omni-channel experience and opportunity for the citizen, but also that very lightweight cloud-based approach to application for the actual staff member, which enabled them to work from home. So those cities that have adopted a cloud approach to data management, to software as a solution, have fared very well post-COVID. Post-vaccine, we see much more of this continuing. So as it relates to sentiment analysis or data communication to and from constituents, we know that that's going to continue to play a larger and larger role. And what we're seeing at Oracle is the need for AI to augment that engagement with residents so that you can do things like understand the tone and tenure of a conversation. Maybe it's with a health and human services expert that really needs to understand more than just what's being said, but how it's being said. So we're using AI and experimenting on ways that we can use artificial intelligence to provide deeper insights into the conversations. So that's a very brief overview, but definitely I think the exciting parts to come are when cities and states come back to work in a more normal fashion, and to realize how different that's going to be than the type of services we experienced in, say, December of 2019. A very different world to come.
A lot of learnings out of this whole pandemic that will sustain. That's very good, Peter. Kim, I've got a question for you relative to getting back to focus on open data, which is our main topic here. So in state of Tennessee, what role does open data play in the state data strategy and operations? So your regular operations, used by employees, how you may be modifying some of your internal processes.
Yeah, well, it's definitely one of the key pieces. The citizens are demanding it. And as you know, the average person becomes more and more data savvy, I see that need growing. So we understand that, you know, as we put data out there and advertise it for availability and usage, we need to do it in such a way to where it's pretty much like hands off. So we don't build a lot of internal processes for how do we get the data from here to there. So we're putting as much automation as we can in place, waiting for this explosive growth to continue the pattern that it's been on. And then additionally, you know, trying to build that roadmap and understand the desires from the citizens long before they have to ask for it. We've started playing around a little bit with having live chat available so we can get immediate feedback on the open data, as well as, you know, an easier way to request new data become available and questions on that. So just starting to play around with that a bit, but we do understand that it's going to become, you know, a business segment of its own, and we want to be fully prepared for that.
Very good. I want to stay on this topic, Carlos, a little bit. As stated on your website in the Commonwealth of Virginia, employees don't need to be data or technology experts to use FACT, F-A-A-C-T. They just need approval and training to access the platform. So how much background and training would someone absolutely have to begin to use this fantastic capability you created? And this would be getting back to this idea of citizen or employee as data scientist, right?
Absolutely, Eric. And so really the only experience they would need to have is domain experience in the questions that they're trying to answer. Really the way we've designed the interfaces is to be as intuitive as possible, where, you know, you don't have to know how the sausage is made, right? To be able to take advantage of the intelligence that's presented to you. And that's really the philosophy that we're going after. It, as Kim was mentioning, there's a lot of things that happen from the time that the data is ingested in the transactional system to the time that it shows up on the intelligence product. And so, you know, for the user of that intelligence platform, they don't need to know all of that stuff that goes in it. Now, having said that, though, we have created a web-based training that goes into data governance and talks about how the Commonwealth of Virginia views data governance and views how data governance is important to make sure that we're leveraging our data as a strategic asset, right? So there is training that's available to all Commonwealth employees on our learning management system free of charge for them to kind of get up to speed on what's going on in data governance. And then with that same platform, we're planning on incorporating additional training modules on, you know, business intelligence and data analytics and other forms of data acumen to really start building up that capacity for people to understand that the road that the data travels to get to that intelligence platform is important, and it's something that we should all start being more mindful of, but it's not necessarily a requirement for you to be able to leverage the intelligence to make a better informed decision. So at the end of the day, you know, really it's just having an understanding of what question it is you're trying to answer, and then being able to utilize the intuitive interface and the data products behind it to be able to make a better informed decision.
Very good. Peter, let's stay on that a little bit here. From your perspective, what are effective methods for putting new analytical capabilities in the hands of our employees as well as our citizens?
That's a good question. You know, I think I go back to my point earlier about you got to understand who your audience is. And I think if anything, we've realized that just putting data out there is not good enough. It's got to be current. It's got to be standardized. It's got to be consumable. So you know, something that we've learned is that number one, first and foremost, it has to be secure. And I think if you see what happened with United Health, you've seen what's happened in the state of Texas. If there's state of Washington, if there's anything that we've learned coming out of COVID, is that you can't take security as an afterthought. So if you're going to have open data, you got to make sure that security is top of mind. That being said, I think standardization and understanding your audience, you won't provide the same data set to a data scientist that's trying to create an application than you would for a resident, like a realtor that's looking to see, you know, what were all the permits issued for residential buildings in your city in the last 6 months. So we've learned that you know, open data platforms need to be much more sophisticated than they used to be, and they need to be consumer specific. And I think at Oracle, we've come to realize that in a big way, and we've done partnerships with ESI Thought Labs over the last 2 years and going on our 3rd year, and really peeled back the layers of the onion, so to speak, about what is a smart city. And we realized, related to this conversation, is that data is the rocket fuel for making informed decisions, making impactful decisions. All the information that we get from our IoT devices, all the information from the various enterprise solutions, all the data that is readily available from public agencies, unless that data is consumable, unless that data is actionable, it really doesn't make a difference. And what we're realizing that smart cities without a data-centric plan on how to consume and make that data actionable is just a city with a lot of data, a city with a lot of sensors. And so to your point, I think we need to be conscious of who's consuming the data and for what reason, so that we can use that information to help our decision makers make more informed decisions, make our constituents learn more about what's actually happening. And as you know, public agencies is an industry of industries. You have the public safety department putting out very different data than, say, your HR department or your park and recreation department, all of which has information that's readily and should be readily available by the public. So I think we need to be sophisticated. We need to be smart. We need to be security centric, and we need to make sure we understand who's consuming the data and how we can make it as readily available and pre-digest that data as best we can.
Very good. Thank you, Peter. Kim, a question for you. You know, we talk a lot about citizens, employees, internal process, employing and exploiting open data. How do you develop a data culture and a government structure around data that includes open data?
Yeah, that's a big question. I've tried it several different ways, and there's a lot of really good books written on this topic. But as you've mentioned a couple times, it's really in that communication, it's in that evangelism. You know, keep it in the forefront of everyone's minds as you're working through it. I've learned that there's much faster and a much higher degree of success if you can get a champion at the executive level, someone that's, you know, following the work that you're doing, understands the impacts, starts sharing your message with others. Here at the state of Tennessee, we have put together some pretty broad ranging data communications training videos. And we've had pretty good uptake on that, which in those videos, it's really saying, you know, data is everyone's job. Whether you're the producer or you're the consumer, you have a role to play. And if you don't understand why the data is saying or looking like it, you know, you have the right and the responsibility to question it. So just trying to drive back to the highest degree of data quality back at the source. But I also use the Data Governance Committee as that cheerleading squad to take the message back to, you know, the agencies and drive it that way.
Very good. Carlos, I want to go back to you, building that data trust. So as you've begun to expand the role of the data trust, and you're trying to assist people, either employees or even citizens or companies or organizations, nonprofits, in effectively using that open data resource, do you have a team that you've assembled, maybe even in an informal basis where you'll call in maybe someone from epidemiology or infectious diseases, public health, public safety, economics, to help citizens, even data scientists, ferret out those inferences from their analysis, guide further analysis, possibly then what to do about their conclusions?
So we do have subject matter experts identified for all of the data sets that we're documenting in our metadata catalog. But as far as citizen access to those individuals, I mean, right now, you know, we're in the middle of the pandemic response. Yeah. You know, we do make our emails and all of our point of contact available to citizens for them to reach out, and they do. But our response rates obviously have been impacted by COVID, right? And so, you know, being able to create, I mean, just like what Kim was saying, you know, develop that community of practice, right? Establish across the different roles those entities that can participate in that discussion and provide support for a wide variety of different stakeholders, right? Depending on who those stakeholders are. And so within the Commonwealth, you know, not only we have this data stewards group, we have data governance committees, which are either agency focused or project focused. So, you know, if you have a project like FACT or the COVID-19 response or VLDS, those all have data governance committees. But then you have the overarching Data Governance Council, which is where the majority of the high-ranking data stewards participate in the discussion on, you know, how do we govern our data assets? How do we provide that support to our stakeholders? But in addition to that, you know, she also mentioned executive sponsorship, right? You know, those champions. Right. And that's where the Executive Data Board comes into play. So from a governance perspective, you know, the Data Governance Council can recommend and promote different, you know, standards, policies, and best practices. But it's really up to the Executive Data Board to approve and implement those standards, policies, and best practices, right? Because I don't have authority over those employees to say, this is what you need to do, right? Because that is left up to the executive leadership of each of those executive branch agencies. Yeah. So that kind of completes the cycle. But then going back to, you know, higher level state leadership, where we talk about the Virginia Data Commission, which is where you have, you know, the governor's cabinet secretaries, you know, members of the legislation, both delegates and senators, members of, you know, geographically dispersed stakeholders that are participating in the larger context of how do we leverage data as an asset to solve some of our most complex problems, like the opioid crisis, like the COVID-19 pandemic, like infant and maternal mortality, you know, recidivism, things that a particular agency just doesn't have the ability to address, but that collectively as a Commonwealth we can. And so the idea behind the Virginia Data Commission is to look at those really large, complex problems, boil them down to some goals and objectives that we want to achieve, and then hand those down to the Executive Data Board to say, okay, based on these goals and objectives, what can your agency do to meet those, you know, what can you establish as a performance target that's going to help us meet these goals, and then translate that down to actual data analytics that say, okay, well, what are our business processes that are most influential in moving that needle? And then getting better insight into how our services, our government services, actually impact the outcomes that our stakeholders experience.
Very good, Carlos. Thank you. I'm going to go back a little bit to, Peter had talked about, there was a first launch of open data across the states and communities, and it didn't really bring back what we anticipated. We had high expectations. We seem to be sort of in that second iteration, but as we come to the close of this panel and this session, I want to look ahead a little bit. The next hill, even the next hill, and I want to show you a couple of slides. I stay in touch with Pacific Northwest National Laboratory just to know what they're doing. I was first exposed to what they're doing in visual analytics back in about 1991, and I've just been impressed with their work ever since. But in future, we're seeing some of these virtual reality capabilities and a number of ways of looking at data and analyzing data, and just wondering, and there's a whole network that includes, for instance, Purdue University and others. But as you're looking ahead, and I know that, you folks like me, you're very enthusiastic about this field. So you stay, on top of what's coming because you're excited about what is possible. But what do you see coming in the next, let's say, 3 to 5 years? Let's start with you, Carlos. We'll ask each one of you, what's the most exciting things that you're anticipating relative to data analytics, even open data, maybe even more use and employment by not only our employees, but citizens? Carlos, we'll start with you, please.
So one of the things that we've done, Eric, is establish the Data Science Brain Trust and the Commonwealth Data Internship Program, which facilitates interactions between our academic institutions and our agencies that are trying to address some of these data problems that we have, right? And so being able to leverage our universities as our R&D for the government, right? And being able to come up with a variety of different analytics and algorithms and machine learning algorithms or different implementations of AI, and then be able to translate and bridge from that research into our operations so that it becomes something that we can use instead of something that's just been created in the lab and then doesn't have any real world application beyond just what they did from an academic perspective. And so it's really being able to facilitate that transition between what's developed in the academic institutions with all of the forward thinking technology, innovative technologies that are being developed, but then be able to take that in the context of what problems are we actually trying to solve and how do we implement that in an operational context. And that is essentially, from an organizational perspective, really the focus of how we bring all of these pieces together to really move that needle forward. So when you talk about innovative technologies that are going to be more immersive, more, give us a better handle on what is happening out in the real world, I say all of it, because at the end of the day, it's not what I, as a limited individual, can look at and pursue, but it's what collectively we as a Commonwealth can start making progress towards and be able to implement within our operational environment.
Very good. Thank you, Carlos. Peter, what are your thoughts on the future, the next, what's coming?
Yeah, that's a great question, by the way. And I really like the idea to pick up on what Carlos mentioned. I clearly believe, and at Oracle, we've made great advancements in the use of AI in driving informed decisions. Using AI, for example, in ERP solutions so that it understands what kind of reports you're going to be looking for at what time of the month, providing you real-time feedback so that you can make tiny course corrections instead of sweeping turns in response to where your finances are headed or how your business license revenue is coming to fruition. But what we're seeing is that use of the enterprise performance management coupled with AI to really give you that real-time dashboard perspective to know exactly where you're headed and if you're headed in the right direction, rather than these points of time data that tells you that you're off course and now you need to course correct. Very different, and it's steering rather than sailing, where you're constantly having to triangulate where your next movement should be. The other area that we're seeing a lot of innovation is the elimination of silos. If anything, government is siloed with these data that doesn't communicate with each other. And what we've been able to do with a lot of our middleware products are eliminate those silos by giving all of those various disparate systems the ability to see each other. Great example of that is Cook County, where we were able to take about 26 different law enforcement agencies that were using a variety of systems and solutions, both legacy and on the cloud, and give them one platform to make sure that all the information is visible to any one of those 26 different agencies. So when you're talking about criminal activity, or your point, Carlos, about recidivism, which we've done some great work with in Alaska, eliminating those data silos without the expensive cost of transferring all of those legacy systems into a new expensive system, but giving them a bridge where they can talk to each other and see data, or in this case, a case of a violent offender or somebody that's going through the system, whether it's to the penal office or to corrections or court systems, the ability to see all of that data about that one individual as they go through the various systems is going to be a game changer as we think about the future of data and the ability of government agencies to see what their neighbors, what their counterparts are doing in other parallel agencies.
Just as an example, that you brought up recidivism, the question is that a public health issue? Is it a public safety issue, an economic issue, education issue? And Peter will say,
everything.
Yes. And that we published a report on enterprise portfolio management. We had said, there's this interconnection, and as Carlos had said earlier, the silos of data, we're trying to get rid of those. And Kim had said as well, this integration, when we're solving these problems for our citizens, we're touching all of these spheres. Let's go to Kim. What's your periscope or telescope tell you the future of data management, analytics, open data? What are the four of us going to be doing in about 4 years?
Yeah, well, I hope to be doing what Carlos and Peter are suggesting, because I agree 100%.
Yeah.
So I'm going to answer the question around open data, and maybe it's a bit specific for the state of Tennessee, but what I would like to see happen with open data is not just for the state to dump it out there, but it actually becomes a knowledge exchange. So if somebody pulls down their some open data, they build some analytics on it, a place to exchange that back. So, we can all leverage that, use that knowledge, model it for other purposes. So that's what I would like to see happen with it.
Definitely into the co-creation stage, right, Kim?
Yes, correct.
Very good. Carlos, Peter, Kim, I really appreciate having you on this panel. You are absolutely outstanding. Thank you so much. I hope to have you on a future panel at our organization, NASCIO. So thank you. Have a wonderful afternoon. Thank everyone here who's participated and listened to this podcast. We'll go ahead and close this for now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Eric. Thanks,
Thank
Kim.
you, Eric. Thank you.